"You've become a burden to this family, Evelyn," my daughter-in-law said as she slid the papers across the dinner table. "And it's time we all started being honest about that." I looked down at the stack of documents sitting beside my untouched plate of pot roast and garlic mashed potatoes, the same recipe my late husband Thomas had loved for nearly 40 years, and for a moment, the only thing I could hear was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room. Michael sat 2 seats away from me, staring at his water glass instead of my face, his shoulders tense beneath the navy sweater I bought him last Christmas. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, and the warm yellow light above the table made everything feel strangely calm for a moment that was quietly tearing my life apart. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't ask Claire how long she had been waiting to say those words out loud. Instead, I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate and looked at the papers she wanted me to sign. "It's just temporary," Claire continued in that polished voice she used whenever she wanted to sound compassionate. "The house is too much responsibility for you now. Michael and I can manage things better if the property is officially transferred into our names." Officially transferred. Such neat little words for something so ugly. I glanced around the dining room that Thomas and I spent 22 years building together. The mahogany cabinet in the corner still held the china set we bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Charleston. The pale cream curtains were ones I had sewn myself 3 winters ago while recovering from knee surgery. Every inch of that house carried pieces of my life stitched into it. Yet Claire spoke about it the same way someone talked about replacing old furniture. "Mom," Michael finally said quietly, still not meeting my eyes, "it just makes sense financially." Financially? That word hurt more than Claire's insult somehow. I raised my coffee cup slowly, mostly to steady my hands. The dark roast had already gone cold. "I see," I answered softly. Claire relaxed instantly after hearing those words. I noticed the small smile that flickered across her face before she reached for her wine glass. That was the first mistake she made that night. She thought silence meant surrender. She thought a 68-year-old widow sitting quietly at the end of the table was weak. What Claire never understood was that silence can be sharper than anger when used correctly. "I'm glad you're here with me today. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes the people who seem the quietest are the ones carrying the heaviest truths." It had been only 3 months since we buried Thomas. 3 months since I stood beneath a gray October sky holding my son's arm while the minister spoke about devotion, loyalty, and family. I still remembered the smell of wet grass at the cemetery and the unbearable emptiness waiting for me when I returned home afterward. For 42 years, Thomas had filled every room in that house with noise. Jazz records on Sunday mornings. Baseball games playing too loudly in the living room. His habit of humming while watering the backyard roses. When he died from heart complications that spring, the silence inside the house became something alive. Heavy. Endless. Claire changed after the funeral. Before Thomas passed, she had always been careful around me. Polite. Controlled. She brought store-bought pies during holidays and hugged me lightly at family dinners while calling me Mom in front of other people. But after the funeral, the mask began slipping little by little. Suddenly, I was too forgetful to handle paperwork, too emotional to make financial decisions, too fragile to live alone. It started with small comments. "You shouldn't drive at night anymore, Evelyn. Maybe it's time to think about assisted living. This house is overwhelming for someone your age." Every sentence sounded caring on the surface, but underneath was something colder, something patient. And Michael changed too. Not overnight. Slowly, quietly, like someone stepping farther away in the dark without realizing it. My son used to call me every Tuesday morning on his drive to work. After Claire started managing their schedules, those calls disappeared. Family dinners became shorter. Holidays became complicated. Somehow there was never enough room for me anymore, even inside my own family. "You don't need to decide tonight," Claire said sweetly as she pushed the papers closer toward me. "We're only trying to help you." Help me. I looked down at the signature line waiting at the bottom of the page, then toward the hallway where a framed photograph of Thomas still hung beside the staircase. He was smiling in that picture, one arm wrapped around my shoulders during a lake trip in Vermont 15 years ago. And suddenly, I remembered something my husband once told me after a difficult business deal nearly ruined one of his closest friends. "When people rush you into giving away power," he had said quietly, It usually means they're afraid of what happens if you keep it. That memory settled into my chest like a match catching flame. I reached for the pen beside the papers, and Claire leaned forward slightly, unable to hide her anticipation. But instead of signing the transfer documents, I calmly pulled a folded piece of paper from my sweater pocket and signed my own name across the bottom line instead. Neither of them noticed what it was. Not then. Michael finally looked up. "What's that?" he asked. I placed the paper back into my pocket carefully and gave him the same gentle smile I used to give him as a little boy whenever he scraped his knee or failed a math test at school. "Nothing important," I said softly. But the truth was, it was the most important thing I had signed in years. And as Claire lifted her wine glass with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won, I sat quietly at the end of the table and let them think exactly that. I said nothing that night. That was my strategy. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of rain sliding gently against the bedroom windows, and for the first time in months, I did not feel helpless inside my own home. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cedar from the old hallway floors Thomas used to polish every winter himself. I sat quietly at the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the pale blue robe hanging beside the closet door, the one Thomas bought me during our anniversary trip to Maine nearly a decade ago. For weeks after his funeral, every morning had felt the same. Heavy, slow, empty in a way I could not explain to anyone who had not buried the person they built their entire life beside. But that morning felt different. Claire thought she had cornered me the night before. Michael thought I would eventually sign whatever papers they placed in front of me because grief had made me weak. What neither of them understood was that grief can sharpen a person when they finally stop being afraid of losing more than they already have. I walked downstairs carefully, my knees aching slightly from the cold weather, and started the coffee maker while the house sat silent around me. The kitchen still looked exactly the way Thomas left it. His favorite navy mug rested beside the sink. The crossword puzzle he never finished sat folded near the toaster oven. Sometimes I still reached for a second plate out of habit before remembering there was no one sitting across from me anymore. I poured myself coffee and stepped toward the dining room doorway. The transfer papers Claire brought the night before were still sitting neatly on the table beside the decorative candle centerpiece. She had intentionally left them behind. A reminder, a pressure tactic, as if seeing those documents every morning would slowly wear me down. I picked them up carefully and began reading every page line by line. Claire clearly assumed I would never bother looking closely. The language was complicated, full of legal phrasing designed to confuse people emotionally exhausted enough to stop asking questions. Permanent property transfer, financial authority reassignment, medical oversight recommendations. By the third page, I realized something cold and ugly was unfolding beneath all the polite language. They were not simply trying to help me manage the house. They were preparing to take control of every part of my life. My home, my accounts, even future medical decisions. I sat very still after that realization settled into my chest. Then I smiled quietly to myself because the document hidden inside my sweater pocket the night before suddenly mattered even more. Around 9 o'clock, Claire arrived unexpectedly. She always entered the house without knocking now, using the spare key Michael insisted she should have after Thomas died. I heard her heels crossing the hardwood hallway before she appeared in the kitchen wearing oversized sunglasses and an expensive cream-colored coat despite the rain outside. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said brightly. I was nearby and thought I would stop in. Nearby? Claire lived 30 minutes away in Westchester Heights. Nothing about her visits was accidental anymore. "Coffee?" I asked calmly. "No, thank you. I only have a minute." Her eyes moved immediately toward the dining room table, toward the papers. "Did you get a chance to look everything over?" I folded the last page slowly and placed the stack back down. "I did." Claire leaned slightly against the kitchen counter, pretending to look relaxed, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders. "And?" she asked carefully. I stirred cream into my coffee without hurrying. "I think your generation worries too much about controlling everything," I said softly. Her expression tightened for half a second before recovering. "We are only trying to protect you." There it was again. Protect. Such a beautiful word used by people planning to take things away. I looked at her directly then, really looked at her in a way I had avoided for years. Claire was beautiful in the polished way magazine advertisements like to sell women. Perfect blonde hair, smooth makeup, white manicure, expensive perfume that lingered long after she left a room. But behind all that perfection was constant calculation. Every conversation with Claire felt rehearsed, like she was always 3 moves ahead in a game no one else realized they were playing. "You know," I said quietly, "Thomas used to say people reveal themselves most clearly when they think nobody is paying attention." Claire laughed lightly, but I saw uncertainty flicker behind her smile. "I'm not sure what that means." "Neither am I," I answered gently. "Not yet." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while the old kitchen clock ticked, steadily above the refrigerator. Then Claire crossed her arms loosely and smiled again, but this time the warmth was gone. "Michael is worried about you," she said. "He thinks living here alone may not be healthy anymore." I nodded slowly as if considering her concern. "That is thoughtful of him. There are beautiful retirement communities nearby," she continued carefully. "Places with medical staff, social activities, transportation. People your age seem happier there." People your age. I almost laughed at how transparent she had become. The night before, she thought intimidation would work. This morning, she was trying softness instead. "And what would happen to this house?" I asked quietly. Claire hesitated only briefly. "Michael and I would probably move in eventually. It would stay in the family." Stay in the family. The irony nearly took my breath away. Because the truth was, Claire had already started acting like the house belonged to her months ago. Rearranging furniture, changing holiday traditions, replacing framed photographs, slowly erasing Thomas and me from the spaces we built together. But what Claire did not know was that Thomas had seen all of this coming long before I did. And before she left that morning, before she stepped back into the rain believing she was still in control, I reached into my cardigan pocket and touched the folded paper I signed the night before. The emergency legal authorization Harold Whitmore prepared 6 years earlier at Thomas's request. A document neither Michael nor Claire even knew existed. And for the first time since my husband died, I finally understood why he made me promise never to underestimate silence. 3 days later, the rain finally stopped, leaving the neighborhood washed clean beneath a pale silver October sky. And for the first time since Thomas died, I found myself watching the street outside my kitchen window not with grief, but with caution. Claire had not returned to the house after our conversation, but that almost made me more uneasy. Women like Claire rarely retreated unless they were planning something better. I spent that Thursday morning organizing old paperwork in Thomas's study, a room. Michael barely entered anymore because he said the smell of his father's leather chair and pipe tobacco made the loss feel too real. For me, the room still felt alive. The shelves lined with financial journals. The brass desk lamp casting warm light across stacks of neatly labeled folders. The faded framed photograph of Thomas shaking hands with the governor after donating land for the County Veterans Center years earlier. My husband believed in preparation. Every receipt, every insurance document, every investment record had its place. By noon, sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in long golden stripes while I sat at the desk reviewing trust paperwork Harold Whitmore drafted years earlier. That was when the doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone. For one brief moment, I assumed it was Claire again. But when I opened the front door, I found a woman around my age standing nervously on the porch holding a tan leather handbag tightly against her coat. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her ears, and there was something familiar about her face even before she spoke. "Evelyn," she asked softly, "I am sorry for arriving unannounced. It is Diane Mercer." I stared at her for a second before recognition hit me. Diane. 20 years earlier, Diane Mercer had worked beside Thomas during the expansion of Carter Industrial Supply. She handled accounting and payroll for nearly a decade before moving to Connecticut after her husband retired from the Air Force. I had not seen her in years. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. There was something tense in her voice that instantly unsettled me. I led her into the kitchen and poured fresh coffee while she removed her gloves carefully, her eyes drifting toward the dining room as though checking whether someone else was inside the house. "You look tired," I said gently. Diane gave a faint smile. "So do you." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table while the coffee maker hummed softly behind us. Outside, leaves drifted across the driveway in the cold afternoon wind. For a few moments, we exchanged polite conversation about retirement, health issues, and how quickly life changes after 70. "But Diane," had not driven nearly 400 miles for small talk. I could see it in the way her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Finally, she leaned forward slightly. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "I debated for weeks about whether I should tell you any of this." My chest tightened immediately. "Tell me what?" Diane glanced toward the hallway before lowering her voice. "About Claire." Hearing her name spoken with that kind of seriousness made something cold settle in my stomach. "What about her?" Diane exhaled slowly. "A few months before Thomas passed away, he called me unexpectedly. He sounded worried." That sentence alone nearly stopped my breathing. Thomas never worried openly. Not even during the recession years when businesses around town were collapsing. "What did he say?" I asked softly. Diane hesitated as though choosing her words carefully. "He told me he thought someone inside the family was trying to gain access to financial accounts they should not have been touching." I sat perfectly still. "Claire." Diane nodded once. At first Thomas thought it was small misunderstandings. Password resets. Duplicate bank requests. Questions about ownership structures. But then he discovered documents had been copied from his office without permission. I looked instinctively toward the hallway leading to Thomas's study. Suddenly, every missing folder and misplaced document over the past year replayed itself in my mind with terrifying clarity. "Why did he not tell me?" I whispered. Diane's expression softened sadly. "Because he was trying to protect you." The kitchen suddenly felt colder despite the afternoon sun still shining through the windows. "Thomas hired Harold Whitmore quietly last spring," Diane continued. "Not for taxes. For asset protection." I stared at her. "Protection from Claire? From anyone who might pressure you after he was gone?" My hands tightened around the coffee mug. "He knew." Diane nodded slowly. "I do not think he fully understood how far things had gone yet. But he saw enough." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes then, not from weakness, but from the realization that Thomas had carried this burden silently while fighting for his own health. "There is more," Diane said carefully. "About 6 weeks ago, one of my former banking contacts called me because your family trust had unusual activity connected to it." "What kind of activity?" Diane looked directly at me. "Someone attempted to transfer partial control authorization using digital copies of your signature." My stomach dropped completely. "That is impossible." "The request was denied because the documentation was incomplete. But Evelyn, the attempt was real." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound in the room was the ticking wall clock above the stove. Then suddenly, dozens of moments I ignored over the past year came rushing back all at once. Claire casually asking where Thomas kept legal records. Michael requesting copies of insurance statements. The strange afternoon, I found Claire alone inside Thomas's study after everyone else had left during Easter dinner. At the time, she claimed she was looking for aspirin. "Dear God, I think they are preparing to move quickly," Diane said quietly, "especially now that Thomas is gone." I lowered my eyes toward the untouched coffee sitting in front of me. "Michael would never intentionally hurt me." Diane's face softened again. "No, Evelyn, I do not think your son understands what is happening. But I do think Claire understands perfectly." That sentence stayed suspended between us like smoke. Because deep down, I already knew she was right. Claire never rushed anything. She planted ideas slowly, quietly, patiently. And suddenly, I realized something even more frightening than the legal documents sitting in my dining room. Claire had not been trying to take my house for months. She had been trying to erase me from my own life piece by piece, while making it look like love. After Diane left that afternoon, I remained alone in the kitchen long after the coffee had gone cold, staring through the window above the sink while the late October sun slowly disappeared behind the trees lining the street. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the quiet way suburban neighborhoods often do before dinner time. Sprinklers clicking softly across trimmed lawns. Children riding bicycles toward home before dark. A delivery truck stopping 2 houses down. Normal life continuing as if my entire understanding of the past several years had not just shifted beneath my feet. I folded my hands together tightly and tried to steady my breathing because once certain truths begin revealing themselves, they do not stop. They pull every memory behind them into the light whether you are ready or not. And suddenly I was remembering things I had spent years excusing. Little moments, tiny discomforts. Small humiliations I convinced myself were misunderstandings because the alternative felt too painful to admit. Claire entered our lives 11 years earlier at a 4th of July fundraiser downtown. Michael had just turned 32 and still carried the gentle optimism Thomas always worried would someday make him vulnerable to the wrong person. Claire was charming immediately. She laughed at all of Michael's jokes, asked thoughtful questions about Thomas's business, complimented my lemon pie recipe before even tasting it. She knew exactly how to make people feel admired, included, important. At first, I was grateful Michael had found someone after years of disappointing relationships and long work hours. Claire seemed polished and ambitious in a way I thought balanced my son well. Their engagement happened quickly, less than 8 months after meeting, but Claire explained she believed people wasted too much time hesitating in life. Thomas thought the timeline was fast, though he never openly criticized her. She always sounds prepared, he told me quietly once while washing dishes after Thanksgiving dinner. Prepared for what? I asked at the time. He gave a small shrug. Everything. I did not understand what he meant then. I do now. The changes started slowly after the wedding. So slowly that I kept dismissing them as normal adjustments between newly married people. Sunday dinners became less frequent because Claire said they needed couple time. Michael stopped calling as often because work had become overwhelming. Holidays moved from our house to hers because she wanted to create new traditions. Every shift sounded reasonable by itself. That was what made it so effective. Claire never demanded control directly. She guided people toward it until they believed the decision had been their own idea all along. I remember the first moment that truly unsettled me happened during Sophia's 3rd birthday party. I arrived early carrying homemade cupcakes with pink frosting because Sophia loved anything strawberry-flavored back then. Claire opened the door smiling politely, but there was tension around her eyes. "Oh," she said after seeing the dessert tray in my hands. I already ordered custom cupcakes from the bakery. I apologized immediately, even though nobody had told me. Claire laughed lightly and said it was not a big deal, but 10 minutes later I overheard her whispering to Michael near the kitchen island. "Your mother really needs to stop making everything about herself." Those words stayed with me for weeks afterward. Not because they were loud, because they were quiet, careful, designed to sound reasonable if repeated later. After that, similar moments began happening everywhere. Family photographs where Claire positioned herself between Michael and me. Vacation plans I somehow learned about after tickets had already been booked. Christmas gifts exchanged privately before I arrived because the timing worked better for the kids. Every exclusion came wrapped in politeness, so smooth it made me question my own instincts. Once, during a family barbecue at Claire's sister's house, I walked into the backyard carrying lemonade and heard Claire say softly to one of her friends, "Michael worries about his mother constantly. She has become so emotionally dependent since Thomas got sick." The conversation stopped immediately when they noticed me standing there. Claire smiled warmly and asked if I needed help carrying the drinks. I said no. But that night, for the first time, I cried after coming home from a family gathering instead of before it. Thomas noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Talk to me," he said while sitting beside me on the back porch swing later that evening. The summer air smelled like freshly cut grass and charcoal grills drifting from neighboring yards. I remember staring out toward the dark backyard, while tears slipped quietly down my face. "I think Claire wants Michael to herself," I whispered. Thomas stayed silent for a long moment. Then he sighed softly. "I think Claire wants control of every room she walks into." At the time, I told him he was overthinking things. I defended her because I wanted peace. Because mothers are taught their whole lives to preserve harmony even when it hurts them. But Thomas began watching more carefully after that. And looking back now, I realized he started noticing patterns long before I did. Claire controlled finances inside their marriage completely. She answered most questions directed at Michael during gatherings. She corrected him constantly in subtle ways that sounded playful in public but dismissive in private. "That is not what happened, sweetheart. You always forget details." Let me explain it better. Tiny comments repeated so often they slowly chipped away at his confidence without anyone fully noticing. The hardest part was watching Michael change over time. My son used to laugh easily, used to speak passionately about work projects, baseball games, travel plans. But little by little, he became quieter around Claire, hesitant, careful with his words, almost as if he was constantly trying not to disappoint her. And somehow, every problem in their lives eventually circled back to me. If Michael looked stressed, Claire blamed his concern for my health. If they argued about money, she suggested my home maintenance costs were becoming unrealistic. If holiday plans became complicated, she implied I was emotionally difficult. It was gradual enough that even I started believing parts of it. That was Claire's real talent. She did not destroy people loudly. She rewrote how others saw them until they began doubting themselves too. Sitting alone in the fading kitchen light that evening, I finally understood the most painful truth of all. Claire did not steal my son overnight. She erased me slowly, one careful moment at a time, until even I almost forgot who I used to be before she entered our family. The following Monday morning, I drove downtown to meet Harold Whitmore for the first time since Thomas's funeral, and as I parked outside the old brick law office on Maple Avenue, I realized my hands were trembling slightly against the steering wheel. Not from fear, from clarity. There is something unsettling about finally seeing the full shape of a problem you spent years trying to excuse away. Harold's office occupied the second floor of a historic building overlooking the courthouse square, the same office he had worked from for more than 30 years. Thomas trusted him completely. In our town, Harold Whitmore was the kind of attorney people described with words like careful and discreet. He handled estate planning for judges, business owners, and families wealthy enough to understand that money often creates quieter dangers than poverty ever does. When I stepped into the reception area, the familiar scent of old paper, coffee, and polished wood immediately brought back memories of sitting beside Thomas during business meetings years earlier, while Harold explained investment structures and tax protections in his calm, measured voice. "Mrs. Carter," the receptionist said warmly, standing from behind the desk. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." Harold rose slowly when I entered his office. At 72, he moved carefully after a hip replacement the previous winter, but his sharp gray eyes missed very little. "Evelyn," he said softly, taking both my hands in his for a moment. "I wish this visit were under better circumstances." I nodded quietly and sat across from him near the large bay window overlooking downtown traffic. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases while orange autumn leaves drifted across parked cars. Normal life. Ordinary life. Meanwhile, I felt as though the ground beneath my family had already started cracking open. Harold studied me carefully before speaking again. "Diane called me after she visited you." That did not surprise me. "Then you know why I am here." He leaned back slowly in his chair. I suspected this conversation might happen eventually. My chest tightened at those words. Thomas really was worried, wasn't he? Harold exhaled quietly and removed a thick folder from his desk drawer. "About 6 years ago, your husband began restructuring certain family protections. At the time, he said he wanted to make sure you could never be pressured financially if something happened to him." He placed the folder carefully on the desk between us. At first, I believed he was simply planning responsibly after his heart condition diagnosis. But over time, I realized there was more to it. I stared at the folder without opening it. Why did he not tell me? Harold's expression softened. "Because Thomas loved you enough to know you would try to keep peace at your own expense." That sentence hurt because it was true. Thomas understood me better than anyone ever had. He knew I would sacrifice comfort, pride, even security if it meant avoiding conflict inside the family. Harold opened the folder slowly and slid several documents toward me. "Your home," he explained carefully, "was transferred into a protected family trust 3 years ago." I blinked in confusion. "Transferred? Legally, yes, but not away from you." The trust was designed specifically to prevent unauthorized ownership changes after Thomas's death. I stared at him. "Claire said Michael and I needed to sign transfer papers because the property was still vulnerable after probate." Harold's jaw tightened slightly for the first time since I arrived. Claire is either dangerously misinformed or intentionally deceptive. I felt cold all over suddenly. "Michael signed documents too." "Michael does not legally control the house, Evelyn." Harold tapped one page carefully with his finger. "You do." For several seconds, I could not speak. My entire body felt strangely light, almost disconnected from the chair beneath me. Then why would Claire push so hard? Harold removed his glasses slowly. "Because if you voluntarily transferred authority, the trust protections could be bypassed." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of traffic outside the office windows. Suddenly, Claire's behavior over the past year made terrifying sense. The pressure, the urgency, The emotional manipulation disguised as concern. None of it had been random. There is something else you should know, Harold said carefully. He reached into the folder again and handed me copies of financial request forms. 3 separate attempts were made to access restricted trust records during the last 8 months. I recognized Claire's handwriting immediately on one of the authorization requests. Perfect narrow lettering written with expensive blue ink. My stomach dropped. She forged my initials. Harold nodded grimly. The requests were denied because the signature verification process failed. I lowered the papers slowly onto the desk. My pulse had become so loud I could hear it inside my ears. Does Michael know about this? Harold hesitated before answering. I honestly do not believe your son understands the full situation. I looked toward the window, watching a young mother crossing the street below while holding a little girl's hand. For one painful moment, I remembered Michael at 6 years old running across our driveway in a baseball uniform 2 sizes too large, laughing because Thomas was pretending to be an announcer during Little League practice. My son had once been so open-hearted, so trusting. Claire has been controlling nearly every financial conversation for years, Harold continued carefully. Thomas noticed it long before his health declined. Why did he not confront her? I whispered. Harold gave me a long look before answering. Because he believed confrontation would isolate you from Michael even faster. Tears burned behind my eyes again, but this time I refused to let them fall. Thomas had been protecting me quietly while I kept trying to preserve a version of family that no longer truly existed. Harold folded his hands together on the desk. Evelyn, I need to ask you something directly. Did you sign anything the night Claire brought those transfer papers? I slowly reached into my purse and removed the folded document I had signed at the dinner table days earlier. Harold opened it carefully, and for the first time since I entered the office, a small smile crossed his face. Good, he said quietly. Very good. What does it do exactly? Harold placed the paper back onto the desk gently. It activates the emergency authority Thomas created years ago. I stared at him. Meaning? Harold leaned forward slightly. Meaning Claire no longer realizes she is the one losing control. When I returned home from Harold Whitmore's office that afternoon, the house no longer felt like a place I was slowly losing. For the first time in months, I walked through the front door with the strange calmness that comes from finally understanding where the danger truly lives. The late afternoon sunlight spilled across the foyer floor in soft gold lines, illuminating the framed family photographs Claire had spent years subtly rearranging. I noticed details now that I once ignored. Pictures where I had been moved farther toward the edge of the frame. Vacation portraits where Claire always stood directly beside Michael while I appeared almost accidental in the background. Tiny revisions of family history happening one photograph at a time. I set my purse carefully on the hallway table and walked into Thomas's study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and for several quiet minutes, I simply stood there looking at the shelves he built himself 20 years earlier. My husband had known. Not every detail, perhaps, but enough. Enough to prepare protections without alarming me. Enough to understand that the greatest threat to our family would not arrive screaming. It would arrive smiling politely while asking for signatures. I sat at Thomas's desk and opened the leather folder Harold gave me before I left the office. Inside were copies of the trust agreements, denied transfer requests, account activity reports, and something else that made my chest tighten immediately. A timeline. Harold had quietly documented every unusual financial inquiry connected to our family accounts over the past 3 years. Claire's name appeared repeatedly beside requests for property evaluations, insurance estimates, and ownership clarification forms. Michael's name appeared far less often, and whenever it did, the requests were almost always submitted jointly with Claire. That detail mattered more than anything else. My son was not leading this. He was following. At exactly 6:15 that evening, my phone rang. Michael. I let it ring twice before answering. Hi, sweetheart, I said. Softly. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded distracted, tired. Claire said you met with Harold today. Of course she knew already. Nothing moved inside that family without Claire tracking it somehow. I did. There was a brief silence. Is everything okay? I looked around Thomas's study while holding the phone against my ear. Actually, I answered carefully. I think things are becoming much clearer. Another pause followed that. Claire is worried you might think we are pressuring you. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. Claire always moved immediately to control perception whenever she sensed uncertainty. Are you pressuring me, Michael? I asked gently. No, of course not. His answer came quickly, almost defensively. We just want to help. There was that word again. Help. The most dangerous word Claire ever used. Then there is nothing to worry about, I replied calmly. I heard him exhale softly on the other end of the line, relieved by my tone. Claire found a really beautiful retirement community about 15 minutes from our neighborhood. He continued carefully. They have private cottages, walking trails, a wellness center. It actually looks kind of amazing. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, he still believed this was about comfort. About care, not control. That sounds lovely, I answered quietly. Maybe we can all discuss it over dinner this weekend. Michael sounded surprised. Really? Of course. I leaned back slowly in Thomas's chair. Family decisions deserve family conversations. After we hung up, I sat silently for a long moment before reaching toward the small legal pad beside the desk lamp and writing down everything Michael had just said. Harold instructed me to document every conversation moving forward, every pressure tactic, every financial suggestion, every attempt to influence decisions about my home or assets. Not because we plan to attack anyone, because careful records reveal patterns people cannot explain away later. Around 8 o'clock, Diane called. How did the meeting go? She asked quietly. Thomas protected more than I realized, I told her. Diane remained silent for a second before speaking again. Then Claire is probably moving faster now. What do you mean? Women like her always accelerate when they feel control slipping. I looked toward the dark dining room where the unsigned transfer papers still rested untouched beneath the chandelier. You really think she knows something changed? Diane gave a soft sigh. Claire survives by reading people, Evelyn. She notices hesitation the way other people notice weather changes. That thought stayed with me long after our call ended. And over the next several days, Diane proved correct. Claire became unusually attentive. Suddenly, she was dropping off groceries I never requested, calling to check on me, sending links to retirement communities and articles about senior safety concerns. On the surface, it looked thoughtful, loving even. But beneath every gesture was urgency. I started noticing something else too. Claire had begun mentioning money constantly. Property taxes, home maintenance costs, insurance increases. This house is becoming so expensive for one person, she remarked casually during one visit while running her fingers across my kitchen countertops. You should not have to carry all this stress at your age. I simply nodded while pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups she always claimed were impractical. What Claire did not understand was that I had stopped reacting emotionally to her months earlier without fully realizing it. Somewhere deep inside me, instinct had already recognized her manipulation long before my mind caught up. That was why she kept escalating. Why the pressure was becoming more visible now. Because quiet people are dangerous when they finally stop doubting themselves. One afternoon, while Claire wandered through the living room discussing potential renovations if the family kept the property, I noticed her studying the staircase, the fireplace, the crown molding above the dining room entrance with an expression that no longer looked admiring. It looked possessive. She was not imagining my future there anymore. She was imagining hers. And suddenly I understood something chilling. Claire had already mentally moved into my life long before trying to remove me from it. She had been rehearsing ownership for years. But what she still did not realize was that every conversation, every rushed suggestion, every false display of concern was quietly building the very case Harold needed. Claire believed she was guiding me toward surrender. In reality, she was documenting her own intentions piece by piece while I sat quietly beside her pretending not to notice. And the louder her confidence became, the calmer I felt. Sunday dinner at my house used to mean comfort. Thomas grilling steaks in the backyard even when the weather turned cold. Sophia laughing too loudly at old stories she had heard a dozen times before. Michael opening wine bottles while pretending he understood more about them than he actually did. Family once felt effortless inside those walls. But by the following Sunday evening, the atmosphere around my dining room table felt so tense that even the silverware sounded too loud against the china plates. Claire arrived first, carrying a bakery pie I knew she did not bake herself because she never cooked unless someone else would see it. You did not have to make dinner, she said while hanging her cream-colored coat near the foyer. We could have ordered something easier for you. Easier for you. Every sentence from Claire now carried the same hidden implication. You are old. You are struggling. You cannot manage anymore. I smiled politely and adjusted the casserole dish on the stove. I wanted everyone together. Claire studied me carefully for a second longer than usual. I could almost feel her trying to read whether Harold had changed my thinking somehow. But I simply turned back toward the kitchen counter and continued slicing cornbread as though nothing in the world had shifted. Michael arrived 15 minutes later looking exhausted. The dark circles beneath his eyes had become more noticeable recently, and his shoulders seemed permanently tense now, as though he carried stress even in silence. Sophia followed behind him wearing a blue sweater and carrying her school backpack. At 14, she was old enough to notice tension adults believed they were hiding. "Grandma, your house smells amazing," she said. While hugging me tightly, Claire glanced toward us almost immediately. "Sophia, wash your hands before dinner." It was a small interruption. Tiny, harmless sounding. But I noticed how quickly Claire redirected affection whenever it was aimed toward me. I noticed everything now. We sat down around 6:30 beneath the soft chandelier light, while rain drifted steadily outside the dining room windows. The same dining room where Claire first placed those transfer papers in front of me less than 2 weeks earlier. The same room where Thomas once toasted every Thanksgiving by saying family was the only investment that truly mattered. Halfway through dinner, Claire carefully set down her wine glass and smiled at Michael before looking toward me. "Actually," she said lightly, "Michael and I toured another retirement community this week." There it was. Not even halfway through the meal. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Claire, what?" she asked sweetly. "We are only trying to help your mother explore options." I continued buttering my dinner roll calmly. "What kind of options?" Claire relaxed slightly after hearing my gentle tone. "This place was beautiful, Evelyn. Private gardens, fitness classes, transportation services. They even have an art studio." "That sounds lovely," I answered. "It really is," Claire continued quickly. "And honestly, maintaining a 5-bedroom home alone at your age just does not make practical sense anymore." Michael stared down at his plate. Sophia looked quietly between all of us without speaking. I reached for my water glass slowly. "You seem very invested in where I live." Claire gave a small laugh. "Well, we worry about you." "Do you?" I asked softly. For the first time all evening, genuine tension crossed Claire's face. She was not accustomed to direct questions delivered calmly. "Of course we do," she answered carefully. "This is about making sure you are safe and comfortable. And financially responsible," Michael added quietly, finally speaking. I turned toward him gently. "Do you believe I cannot manage my own finances anymore?" His expression tightened immediately. "That is not what I said." Claire leaned forward. Slightly. "Nobody is attacking you, Evelyn." There was irritation beneath her polished tone now. "We are trying to have an adult conversation about the future." I nodded thoughtfully. "The future is important." The room fell quiet for several seconds except for the sound of rain against the windows and dishes softly clinking as Sophia pushed green beans around her plate without eating them. Then Claire reached into her purse. Slowly, deliberately. My pulse barely changed because I already knew what was coming before she even placed the envelope onto the table beside my plate. "We updated some paperwork," she said smoothly. "Nothing aggressive. Just preliminary planning documents in case you decide the retirement community is the right step." Michael looked uncomfortable immediately. "Claire, maybe tonight is not the best. When would be better?" she interrupted softly. "After another fall? After another emergency?" I looked up sharply. "What emergency?" Claire blinked once. "Well, when you slipped near the driveway last winter." I stared at her. "I stepped on ice while carrying groceries." "Exactly," Claire replied quickly. "That kind of thing becomes dangerous at a certain age." Sophia suddenly looked up from her plate. "Grandma was fine," she said quietly. Claire's eyes moved toward her daughter instantly. "Sophia." But the girl did not lower her gaze this time. "You keep talking about Grandma like she is helpless," she said softly. The entire table went silent. Michael rubbed one hand across his forehead while Claire forced another smile, though I could see anger beginning to tighten her jaw beneath it. "Nobody said helpless," Claire answered carefully. "We are talking about safety." "You talk about selling this house all the time," Sophia replied. "Even when Grandma is not around." Michael's head lifted immediately. "Sophia." But it was too late. Claire's face changed for only half a second, yet it was enough. The mask slipped. Not completely. Just enough for me to finally see the irritation beneath all the practiced concern. Children do not always understand adult conversations, Claire said coldly. I understand more than you think, Sophia answered. Quietly, I reached over and touched my granddaughter's hand gently before looking back toward Claire. Actually, I said calmly, I think Sophia understands exactly what is happening. Nobody spoke after that. Rain continued falling softly outside while tension settled heavily across the table like smoke. Claire stared at me carefully now, no longer confident enough to hide her suspicion. Because for the first time since Thomas died, something inside that room had shifted. Claire was no longer controlling the conversation completely. And deep down, I think she finally realized I had stopped being afraid of her. After that dinner, nothing inside the family felt normal anymore, even though everyone pretended otherwise. Claire became quieter over the next several days, but it was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of recalculation. I recognized it immediately because I had finally stopped seeing her as my daughter-in-law and started seeing her for what she truly was. A strategist. Someone who adjusted quickly whenever control slipped even slightly out of reach. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray, with low clouds hanging above the neighborhood, while I stood in the kitchen watering the small herb plants near the window Thomas installed years earlier. My phone buzzed around 10:15. A text from Claire. Can we stop by later tonight? Michael wants to revisit the conversation calmly. I stared at the message for several seconds before typing back a simple answer. Of course. Calmly. That word told me everything. Claire believed the confrontation at dinner had become emotional instead of strategic. She still thought this was about convincing me. She still believed pressure and patience would eventually wear me down the same way they had over the years before Thomas died. But Harold had spent the previous week moving quietly behind the scenes. The emergency authorization I signed activated additional protections on every trust-connected account. Access logs were now being monitored directly. Property inquiries required secondary verification. Most importantly, any attempt to transfer or refinance trust assets would immediately trigger legal review. Claire had no idea any of that had happened yet. Around noon, Harold called while I was folding laundry upstairs. We had another attempted access request this morning, he said without greeting. I stopped folding one of Thomas's old flannel shirts and sat slowly at the edge of the bed. From Claire. Indirectly, Harold answered carefully. This time it came through a financial planning office in White Plains. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means somebody is preparing for larger asset movement than simple property transfer. I looked toward the bedroom window where bare tree branches moved against the cloudy sky. Can they do anything? Not anymore, Harold replied calmly. But they clearly think they still can. After we hung up, I remained sitting quietly for a long moment while holding Thomas's shirt against my lap. Then slowly, I began understanding the full shape of what Claire had been building all these years. This was never simply about moving me into a retirement community. The house was only one piece. Control of the trust would eventually give access to investment distributions, insurance reserves, business holdings Thomas left protected after retirement. Claire was not trying to remove me from the family. She was trying to replace me as the center of its financial gravity. That realization should have terrified me. Instead, it made me strangely calm. Because once you understand somebody's true objective, their behavior becomes predictable. That evening, Claire and Michael arrived just after sunset. Sophia was not with them. I noticed immediately. Claire preferred difficult conversations without witnesses now. Michael looked exhausted again as he stepped inside carrying a bottle of wine he probably did not remember buying. Claire looked polished as always in a dark wool coat and pearl earrings. But there was tension beneath her composure tonight. She smiled warmly while handing me a small bakery box. I brought lemon pastries from that place downtown you like. I thanked her gently and led them toward the living room instead of the dining room this time. The fireplace flickered softly while rain drifted against the windows again, turning the whole house quiet except for the occasional crackle of burning wood. Michael loosened his tie and sat heavily on the couch, while Claire remained standing for a moment, scanning the room almost unconsciously. Her eyes moved across the antique clock, the bookshelves, the framed oil painting above the fireplace. Measuring, evaluating, planning. Finally, she sat beside Michael and folded her hands carefully together. Evelyn, she began softly. I think things became tense the other night because emotions are running high. I nodded calmly. Grief affects people differently. Claire smiled slightly, relieved by my gentle tone. Exactly. Michael rubbed one hand across his face tiredly. We just do not want this to turn into conflict, Mom. Conflict. Another interesting word. Because conflict only appears once manipulation stops working quietly. I poured tea slowly into 3 porcelain cups before answering. Neither do I. Claire leaned forward slightly. Then maybe we should simplify things. There it was. Her voice softened further as she reached into her designer handbag and removed another folder. This version only gives Michael temporary oversight of property management, taxes, maintenance, insurance coordination. Nothing drastic. I accepted the folder without opening it immediately. You prepared new paperwork very quickly. Claire gave a graceful little shrug. We are trying to reduce stress for everyone. Michael finally looked up toward me. Mom, maybe letting us help for a while would make things easier. I studied my son quietly. He looked older lately. Not physically, emotionally. As though he had spent years balancing pressures he no longer fully understood himself. Michael, I asked softly, when was the last time you made one of these decisions without Claire preparing the conversation first? Silence filled the room instantly. Claire's posture stiffened beside him. Michael blinked in surprise. What? I am simply asking. My tone remained perfectly calm. Do you still know the difference between helping me and managing me? Claire set her teacup down sharply enough to create a soft clink against the table. That is unfair. Is it? I asked gently. For several seconds nobody moved. The fire crackled softly while rain slid down the windows behind us. Then Claire smiled again, but the warmth never reached her eyes this time. I think you are becoming paranoid, Evelyn. The sentence floated through the room quietly, smoothly, carefully chosen. And suddenly I understood exactly how Claire had controlled situations for so many years. She did not attack directly unless necessary. She destabilized people instead. If they questioned her, she made them sound emotional, confused, fragile. Maybe, I answered softly. Or maybe I finally started paying attention. Claire's eyes locked onto mine then, and for the first time since she married my son, neither of us pretended anymore. No smiles, no polished concern. Just silence heavy enough to expose everything sitting beneath it. Michael looked between us uneasily, sensing something fundamental had changed, but still unable to understand what. And in that moment, I realized Claire finally recognized the truth she had spent years avoiding. I was no longer the grieving widow she believed she could quietly push aside. I had become an obstacle, and obstacles make ambitious people reckless. 3 days later, I invited everyone to dinner again. Not because I wanted another argument, but because some truths deserve witnesses when they finally enter the room. Friday evening arrived cold and windy, with dry autumn leaves scraping softly across the driveway, while the house glowed warmly beneath porch lights Thomas installed years ago. I spent the afternoon cooking slowly and carefully, the same way I used to prepare holiday meals when Michael was young. Pot roast, roasted carrots with thyme, homemade biscuits, apple cobbler cooling beside the kitchen window. Every detail mattered to me because this would be the last dinner inside that house where anyone mistook my silence for weakness. Harold Whitmore arrived 15 minutes before the others. I let him in through the side entrance near Thomas's study, and for a moment, seeing him standing inside the house felt strangely comforting. Steady, grounded. He carried a slim leather briefcase beneath one arm and wore the same charcoal overcoat he had worn to Thomas's funeral. Everything is ready, he said quietly once we stepped into the study. I nodded. Do you think Michael knows? Harold removed his glasses slowly. I think your son suspects something is wrong. But suspicion and understanding are not the same thing. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the front windows. Claire and Michael had arrived. Harold remained inside the study while I walked calmly toward the foyer. Claire entered first wearing a fitted cream sweater and pearl earrings again, perfectly composed except for the sharpness now hiding behind her smile. Michael followed carrying a bottle of red wine, while Sophia lingered quietly near the doorway. Grandma, she said softly before hugging me. I held her tightly for a second longer than usual. I am glad you came. Dinner began politely enough. Claire complimented the roast. Michael discussed work stress. Sophia talked about an upcoming school debate competition. On the surface, We looked like any ordinary American family eating dinner together on a Friday night. But tension sat beneath every word now, invisible and heavy like a storm waiting behind dark clouds. Halfway through the meal, Claire finally placed her fork down and looked toward me carefully. Have you thought more about the retirement community? There it was again, always circling back, always steering conversations toward control. I dabbed my napkin gently against my lips before answering. Actually, I said calmly, I have spent the week reviewing quite a few documents. Claire's expression sharpened almost immediately. Michael looked up from his plate. What kind of documents? Family trust records, property agreements, financial access requests. Silence spread slowly across the table. Claire recovered first. That sounds exhausting for you, Evelyn. I smiled faintly. Not really. It is amazing how much energy returns once confusion disappears. Michael frowned slightly. Mom, what is going on? Instead of answering immediately, I stood slowly from the table. Excuse me one moment. I walked toward Thomas's study while nobody spoke behind me. When I returned 30 seconds later, Harold Whitmore stepped quietly into the dining room beside me carrying his briefcase. The moment Claire saw him, all color drained subtly from her face. Harold, Michael said in confusion while standing halfway from his chair. What is this? Harold placed the briefcase carefully onto the dining room table before sitting calmly beside me. Good evening, Michael. Claire's voice became noticeably tighter. Why is our family attorney here? Harold looked directly at her. Actually, Mrs. Carter, I represent Evelyn Carter exclusively. Nobody moved. The chandelier light reflected softly against untouched wine glasses, while rain began tapping lightly against the dining room windows again. Michael looked completely lost now. Mom, he asked quietly. I folded my hands together in my lap and looked at my son gently. Michael, do you know how many attempts were made to access my trust accounts over the last 8 months? His face shifted instantly. What? Claire spoke quickly before he could continue. Evelyn, this is unnecessary. Harold opened the briefcase and removed several folders neatly organized with colored tabs. 3 unauthorized access attempts, he said calmly. 2 property transfer inquiries. 1 falsified signature authorization. Michael stared at him blankly. Falsified. Claire stood abruptly from her chair. This is ridiculous. But Harold continued without raising his voice. Every request originated either directly or indirectly through Claire Carter. That is not true. Claire snapped immediately. I was trying to help manage family assets because Evelyn clearly cannot handle. Stop, Michael interrupted suddenly. The room went silent. He looked at Claire with confusion, slowly turning into something far more painful. What is he talking about? Claire crossed her arms tightly. Your mother is manipulating this situation because she refuses to accept reality. Harold calmly slid copies of the denied requests across the table. These forms contained forged initials matching Mrs. Carter's handwriting patterns. Michael picked up the papers slowly. I watched his face change while he read. Shock first, then disbelief, then something worse. Recognition. Claire, he whispered quietly. Why would you sign Mom's name? I did not forge anything, she answered sharply. I was expediting paperwork because nobody else around here seems capable of making practical decisions. Sophia suddenly pushed her chair back hard enough to startle everyone. You told Dad Grandma wanted help, she said quietly. Claire turned immediately toward her daughter. Sophia, stay out of this. No, the word came out stronger this time. You kept saying Grandma was confused. But she is not confused. You lied. Michael looked between them both as though the entire room had suddenly become unrecognizable. Claire, he said slowly, did you try to transfer Mom's property? Claire laughed once in disbelief, but the sound carried no warmth now. Oh my God, are you all seriously turning this into some kind of attack? I finally spoke then, my voice calm enough that everyone immediately fell silent again. Nobody attacked you, Claire. I looked directly into her eyes for the first time without fear, guilt, or hesitation. You simply became careless because you thought I would stay quiet forever. Claire stared back at me, and for a moment, the polished mask she spent 11 years perfecting disappeared completely. What remained underneath was not concern, not love, just anger at losing control. Harold calmly closed the folder in front of him. As of last week, he said quietly, all trust protections have been fully activated. No transfers, property claims, or financial changes can occur without Evelyn Carter's direct authorization. Michael slowly lowered the papers in his shaking hands while looking toward me with an expression I had not seen since he was a little boy who suddenly realized he had trusted the wrong person. "Mom," he whispered painfully, "how long have you known?" I held his gaze gently across the dining room table, where our family once believed love alone could protect us from betrayal. "Long enough," I answered softly, to understand that silence was the only reason the truth finally revealed itself.